Have you ever heard the story of Flight 401? It's a chilling tale of a plane crash that claimed the lives of 101 people. But that's not where this story ends, because according to witnesses, the ghosts of those who died on Flight 401 still haunt the skies, and are not afraid to let their presence known. Hi folks, I'm Johnny and welcome to The Oddest. This story blew my mind for several reasons. Even the most hardened skeptic would find it hard to disbelieve it. The sheer number of witnesses alone makes it hard to refute. From pilots who have seen strange lights and heard disembodied voices, to passengers who have felt cold hands on their shoulders and seen shadowy figures moving through the cabin. The reports of hauntings on Flight 401 are numerous and disturbing. Once you start listening to these stories, you might just never want to fly again. It was a chilly evening on December 29, 1972 at JFK International Airport in Queens, New York. The clock was ticking towards 8:30 p.m. Passengers milling about the bustling airport were suddenly captivated by a familiar voice echoing through the intercom. It announced that Eastern Airlines Flight 401 to sunny Miami was now ready for boarding. About half an hour later, the aircraft stood ready to take flight. A total of 176 passengers, along with 13 dedicated crew members, had made their way on board. It was no ordinary flight though. This was Eastern Airlines Flight 401, and it was a marvel of technology. It was the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, and it was a giant in the skies. Instead of the usual 4 seats in a row, this massive beast had 8 seats per row, and it's not just that, it had 2 levels. The main cabin on the upper level was where all the passengers settled, and it was nothing short of impressive. But what made this plane truly extraordinary was its secret, a lower level, accessible only by 2 tiny elevators at the rear of the aircraft. Down there, hidden from view from all the passengers, was a full-scale kitchen with ovens and refrigerators. It was like a chef's dream, right in the sky. And that's not all. At the very back of this lower level, there was a cosy lounge which awaited the flight staff. It was a place where they could relax and chat. Little did the passengers and the crew members know that this flight would go down in history for something other than its incredible amenities. The tale of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 was about to take a dark and unexpected turn. On that fateful night, the cockpit of Eastern Airlines 401 was under the command of Captain Bob Loft, a strikingly handsome 55-year-old pilot with an impressive 30,000 hours of flying experience. Now, to put that into perspective, that's a mountain of experience in the piloting world. Captain Bob was renowned for being a perfectionist, exuding confidence and staying cool as a cucumber under pressure. Once he had boarded the aircraft, he took his place in the captain's seat. His co-pilot, Bert Stockstill, a man 10 years his junior, joined him, occupying the seat immediately to his right. With the pilot and co-pilot duo in place, the final members of that night's cockpit crew made their entrance. Now, most passenger jets only have 2 seats in the cockpit, but the L-1011 planes were in a league of their own. They boasted a whopping 4 seats in the cockpit. One of the last 2 crew members to enter the cockpit that night was the flight's engineer, Don Repo. He was a big burly man, known for his soft-spoken and approachable nature. Despite his imposing stature, Don was the kind of person that you would easily strike up a conversation with. He offered a friendly greeting and took his seat right behind the co-pilot, Bert. Just a few moments later, 47-year-old Angelo Donadeo entered the cockpit. Angelo was not part of the rostered crew that night, but was hitching a ride. This is commonplace if a member of the flight crew needs to get to somewhere in order to bring a plane back. At around 9:10 that night, after all the pre-flight checks were done, passengers were comfortably seated and the crew was in their positions. Captain Bob taxied this massive Lockheed TriStar over to the runway. 10 minutes later, precisely at 9:20 p.m, Captain Bob pushed the throttle forward and the plane surged along the runway, ascending into the inky night sky over New York. Eastern Airlines Flight 401 was now en route to Miami. For the next 2 hours, everything was perfectly ordinary. In fact, it was so smooth that one passenger named Jerry Eskow decided to write a letter praising Eastern Airlines for their great service and how incredibly smooth the flight had already been. His plan was to mail this letter as soon as he touched down in Miami. However, at 11:32 p.m, exactly 2 hours and 12 minutes after takeoff, this routine flight took a spine-chilling turn. As Captain Bob initiated his approach to Miami International Airport and began to lower the plane's landing gear, his co-pilot Bert Stockstill, he noticed a problem. You see, the L-1011 jets, like Flight 401, had a unique landing gear system. There were 3 sets of wheels, those under the left wing, those under the right wing, and the wheels that popped out from the nose of the plane. And Bert noticed that something was amiss. Each of those landing gear components came with a corresponding little green light bulb inside the cockpit. These green lights were there to illuminate once a particular set of landing gear was safely deployed and ready for landing. It was like a signal to the crew in the cockpit that everything was A-OK. But when Captain Bob lowered the landing gear, Bert, his co-pilot, noticed a problem. Only 2 of those green lights blinked to life, while the other one, for the nose landing gear, well, that stayed stubbornly dark. Captain Bob and the rest of the crew, well, they weren't too concerned at first. They just assumed that it was a minor glitch with the actual light bulb, not a problem with the landing gear itself. After all, this plane was brand spanking new and had passed all of its pre-flight checks. The chance of something being wrong with the nose landing gear seemed incredibly slim. Captain Bob, trying to clear up this issue, made the decision to retract the landing gear and then deploy it once again. His hope was that this time all 3 lights would illuminate, signalling that the landing gear was safe and sound. But much to the crew's frustration, when they lowered the landing gear for the second time, well, that stubborn nose landing gear light, it still refused to come on. Growing increasingly concerned and not willing to take any risks, Captain Bob got on the radio and contacted Miami Air Traffic Control. He informed them that he couldn't confirm the safety of the landing gear, so they would need to circle in the night sky for a while just till they figure things out. With Miami Air Traffic Control's guidance, Captain Bob and the crew flew over the vast expanse of the Everglades, a sprawling wetland region in Florida. They were to stay away from other air traffic until they resolved the landing gear issue. Once Flight 401 was safely above the Everglades, Captain Bob and his co-pilot Bert set the plane onto autopilot. It would maintain a steady altitude of 2,000 feet and a constant speed of 200 miles per hour. In the cockpit, Captain Bob and Bert turned their attention to the troublesome nose gear indicator light bulb. They were convinced that it was the source of their problems. They tried pushing it, twisting it, and even took it out and gave it a good cleaning by blowing dirt away and any grime, but their efforts were in vain. The light didn't come back on, and to their dismay, they had accidentally jammed the bulb in sideways. It seemed impossible to remove it again. Frustration was mounting, and the need to ensure the safety of the nose landing gear was absolute paramount. Captain Bob then turned to Don Repo, the flight engineer that was sitting just behind the co-pilot. He issued an urgent command for Don to descend into the hellhole and inspect the front landing gear with his own eyes. Now, you might be wondering, what's this hellhole? Well, it's a small space located directly below the cockpit. In order to access it, you have to use a trapdoor in the floor in the centre of the cockpit. Once inside this hellhole, there's a window that allows you to peer straight towards the front of the aircraft. From this wee window, you can visually confirm if the nose landing gear was down or up, or locked in place or not. Meanwhile, Don Repo, following Captain Bob's urgent request, well, he left his seat and opened up the trapdoor to access this hellhole. The weight of the task weighed heavily on him as he descended below the cockpit to inspect the front landing gear. Approximately 2,000 feet below Flight 401, a man named Robert Marquis, aged 43, was with a friend, both on an adventure in the heart of the Everglades. They were aboard an airboat, a flat-bottomed vessel equipped with a massive fan at the back that allowed them to navigate the shallow waters of the Everglades. See, in some parts of this vast wetland, the water was only a few inches deep, so this vehicle was ideal for traversal. As they floated in the inky darkness, their only source of light was the headlamp that was worn by Robert. It was pitch black all around them, with no signs of buildings or people for miles and miles. Amidst the darkness, They could hear the unsettling sounds of alligators growling, snakes slithering, and frogs croaking in the tall grass. While they stood there, silently scanning their surroundings, Robert noticed something out of the corner of his eye. It was a sudden, massive burst of orange and yellow light that seemed to erupt from the ground about 5 miles away. Before he could fully comprehend what he was seeing, the flash had vanished just as quickly as it appeared. Intrigued and filled with curiosity, Robert turned to his friend, who hadn't witnessed this strange occurrence, and suggested that they go quickly to check it out. Robert wasted no time. He revved up his airboat and headed straight toward the location where he'd witnessed this strange flash. For the next 15 minutes, they cruised at a brisk 40 miles per hour, cutting through the dark expanse of the Everglades. Now, back aboard Flight 401, something ominous was unfolding. About 20 minutes earlier, when Captain Bob had turned around to instruct Flight Engineer Don Repo to go into that hellhole, well, he accidentally nudged the steering wheel. This tiny nudge was sufficient to disengage the plane's autopilot, causing the aircraft to begin a gradual descent. The darkness outside the cockpit offered no visual clues as to the descent, especially since there were no lights or moon that night. It was like staring into a bottomless dark void. Additionally, the descent was so gradual that it didn't even feel like a sudden drop, it was more just like a subtle shift. To make matters worse, the crew inside the cockpit remained entirely absorbed in their attempts to fix this light bulb issue. Their collective focus was so intense that when an alarm sounded, which indicated that they had dipped below their intended altitude of 2,000 feet, well, no one noticed. I mean, to their credit, the alarm only sounded once, and it wasn't particularly loud. Shortly after Don Repo descended into this hellhole, the situation aboard Flight 401 took a dire turn. The plane crashed into the unforgiving terrain of the Everglades. The passengers, the cockpit crew, and the flight staff were completely unaware of the impending catastrophe. They were thrust into an emergency they could not comprehend. The unimaginable happened upon impact. The plane exploded. The tremendous burst of flames illuminated the night sky, creating that vivid yellow and orange flash that Robert Marquis had observed. Robert and his friend immediately rushed to the crash site, becoming the first responders. As they arrived, they were met with a cacophony of screams, cries and moans, yet they couldn't see the carnage. The ferocious fire from the explosion had already been extinguished thanks to the swampy wetlands, which absorbed all the flames. What's astonishing is that the plane, despite crashing at speeds of over 200 miles per hour, had not struck the ground at a steep angle. This was because the aircraft had been in a gradual descent pattern, coasting until impact with the ground. Combine this with the soft, muddy ground of the Everglades, and the result was that the crash's impact was far less violent than one might expect from a normal plane crash. This fortunate circumstance ultimately played a crucial role in saving lives amidst the chaos and devastation that unfolded that fateful night. In the aftermath of the crash, it became evident that dozens of passengers had managed to survive the initial impact with the ground, although many were left with horrific injuries or were trapped within the wreckage, or sometimes both. As Robert and his friend arrived at the edge of the crash site, they were confronted by a scene of unimaginable horror. Robert, his headlamp illuminating the night, saw body parts sticking out of the muddy ground. Their light fell upon the first survivor that they encountered, a man whose clothes had been incinerated by the explosion, leaving him with just a few remnants of socks on both ankles. This survivor was still strapped into his seat, which had fallen forward into the muddy water, submerging most of his upper body and face. The man's facial expressions pleaded for help as Robert's light hit his face. Without hesitation, Robert and his friend jumped off their airboat and hurried to the man's aid. They wrestled the sea out of the water, saving the man from a watery grave. But their rescue efforts were far from over. In the darkness, they heard more cries for help, as more survivors emerged from the wreckage. Robert and his friend did their utmost to save as many people as they could, but the sheer number of people in distress just, overwhelmed their efforts. Around 30 minutes after Robert and his friend had arrived at the crash scene, the Coast Guard also arrived in helicopters. They joined forces with Robert and his friend, working tirelessly throughout the night to rescue as many people as possible from this mangled wreckage. As the sun rose the following day, the heart-wrenching reality became clear. There were no more survivors left to save. The devastating crash of Flight 401 had claimed the lives of 101 people, while 77 individuals had managed to survive. Among the fallen were Captain Bob Loft, his co-pilot Bert Stockstill, and flight engineer Don Repo, who had ventured down into the hellhole. Miraculously, among the survivors was Angela Donadeo, the fourth man in the cockpit, and Jerry Eskow, the very passenger who had penned that letter to praise the Eastern Airlines before tragedy struck. A full and comprehensive investigation launched following the crash, and it would confirm that Flight 401's tragic fate resulted from a combination of factors, with human error being one of the most significant contributors. The investigation also concluded that the nose landing gear had been in perfect working order, and the unlit indicator was due to a burned out light bulb. In the aftermath of this tragedy, Eastern Airlines made extensive efforts to provide compensation to the survivors and the families of those who lost their lives. They also instituted major changes in their training programs for pilots, co-pilots and all personnel that were involved in any cockpit operations, striving to ensure that such a catastrophic disaster would never happen again. However, the story of Flight 401 didn't end with that crash. In the cramped cabin, rain hammered against the windows, adding to the tension among the passengers on the plane. They were eager to escape the miserable winter conditions in Albany and start their 4-hour flight to the warmer climate of Miami. However, there was no indication that their journey would begin anytime soon. See, a refuelling issue had already delayed their departure by over an hour, and the stewardess had resorted to performing a head count of passengers for the third time. The count continued to come up short of the correct number. Finally, the stewardess identified the source of the discrepancy and made her way across the cabin to a row of seats at the very front, where a solitary male figure sat. As she approached him, she recognised that he was wearing a uniform of a fellow Eastern Airlines employee. She assumed that he just might be on the flight as a favour arranged by one of his pilot colleagues. However, when she asked him about his plans, the man continued to stare straight ahead, completely ignoring her. Despite several more attempts at communication and the growing unease among passengers, the stewardess could not elicit a response from this unknown traveller, whose gaze remained fixed on a point on the cabin wall directly in front of him. Realising the seriousness of this situation, the stewardess called for her supervisor. Even he couldn't get any response from this mysterious passenger, whose gaze didn't change and didn't move. The supervisor decided to involve the flight crew and hurried to the cockpit, leading the captain to this perplexing scene. The captain's eyes widened in disbelief as he laid eyes on this lone passenger, and the coffee mug that he had been holding slipped from his hand, spilling its contents onto the cabin floor. The passenger's face, once familiar to the captain, seemed to softly dissolve into nothingness, as if being carried away by an imperceptible breeze. This man had passed away almost a year prior to the day to this encounter, one of the many victims of the tragic air crash that had occurred in the very same destination they were waiting to fly to. What made it even more uncanny was that the ill-fated flight had involved the exact same model of aircraft that they now stood in. See, because Flight 401 had crashed in the swampy Everglades, it was decided to recover some or most of the plane's functioning components and distribute them among the rest of the airline's fleet. It was during the first few months of the surviving crew members and salvage components of Flight 401 being integrated back into other aircraft that a series of unsettling events began to take place. In the summer of 1973, a senior vice president at Eastern Airlines was scheduled to fly from New York to the company's headquarters in Florida. His status afforded him luxury travel on company aircraft. Upon boarding the flight, the executive made his way through the plane's interior to the first-class cabin and settled into an unclaimed seat. A few minutes later, a uniformed pilot from the airline asked if he could occupy the seat next to him. As more passengers boarded, the two men engaged in conversation about the company that they worked for. While the vice president tried to recall the pilot's name, it was only when a casual reference was made to the incident that had occurred the previous year that he suddenly realised he was speaking to Bob Loft, the now deceased captain of Flight 401. In a heartbeat, a flicker of understanding seemed to pass across Loft's face, and he promptly disappeared right before the very eyes of the fellow passengers. Shocked and bewildered, the Vice President quickly jumped up from his seat and demanded to be allowed off this aircraft, causing quite a scene among all the passengers and crew as he exited. Weeks later, an identical incident was reported. A female passenger was discovered in hysterics, subsequently claiming that she had just seen a ghost. She described how a uniformed pilot had sat down next to her and engaged in conversation for a short time before vanishing during mid-sentence. The woman later identified the person she had seen as Captain Loft when his image was included among several photos that she had been shown. Over time, rumours of further increasingly bizarre incidents started to circulate around the close-knit airline community, leaving everyone to grapple with the inexplicable presence of the deceased crew members from Flight 401 on other Eastern Airlines flights. The mystery surrounding these events only deepened as more accounts emerged. During one flight aboard a TriStar travelling from Atlanta to Miami, the flight crew became disturbed by a persistent knocking sound that seemed to be coming from somewhere inside the cockpit. Eventually, the flight engineer was able to pinpoint the source of this sound, and it was emanating from the aircraft's hellhole, a cramped maintenance area situated directly beneath their feet. With the captain's permission, the engineer opened the small hatch, only to instantly recoil in horror. He later reported that as he shone his flashlight down into the darkness below, he saw the face of fellow engineer Don Repo staring back up at him. Shortly after this unsettling encounter, a company mechanic claimed that he had been working alone in a hangar on an aircraft when he was joined by a fellow engineer who he didn't recognise. Pausing his work for a brief conversation, the two engineers discussed the rumours surrounding Flight 401. However, the conversation took an eerie turn when the unidentified colleague's features suddenly grew grave, and he fixed the mechanic with a piercing stare. In slow and deliberate terms, he stated that neither he nor his colleagues would ever allow another Eastern Airlines TriStar to come to harm again, before fading away in front of his very eyes. The mechanic was left in shock, but was sure that the figure he had spoken to was Don Repo. These paranormal reports continued to circulate throughout the company, and the directors faced significant challenges in their attempts to contain their spread. The inexplicable encounters and the persistence of the deceased crew members from Flight 401 created a sense of unease and bewilderment amongst Eastern Airlines employees, ultimately turning the company into a centre for unsettling and unexplainable phenomena. Employees within Eastern Airlines began to refuse travel on airliners that were rumoured to utilise components supposedly recovered from Flight 401. Their fear stemmed from the concern that the deceased crew members from that flight might return from the dead and visit them. This growing apprehension finally prompted the company directors to take action. The pivotal moment came aboard Flight 903 later on that year. The aircraft in question was another Lockheed TriStar travelling its usual route between JFK and Mexico City. A stewardess, Faye Merriweather, was doing her rounds when she looked up for a moment and saw the face of Don Repo peering at her through a window. Suppressing every urge to scream in terror, Merriweather rubbed her eyes several times, hoping that the apparition would just simply disappear. It was only when she called one of her colleagues that the image of the deceased engineer finally faded away and vanished from the window. Shortly after, the second stewardess caught a quick glimpse of Repo's face, recognising him from previous flights. A few minutes later, as she sat in the galley trying to calm her nerves, Merriweather heard a disembodied voice warning her to watch out for a fire on the plane. In a panic, she rushed to the cockpit and relayed what had just happened to the flight crew. However, the crew could not find any trace of such danger on any of their sensors. During the return trip back to JFK, the TriStar's starboard engine suddenly began to smoke and a serious fire developed and spread along the wing. The crew, already somewhat on edge from the ghostly prediction issued by Merriweather during the previous flight, acted quickly and extinguished the blaze and then safely landed the aircraft. The events aboard Flight 903 left the company directors with no choice but to confront the unsettling rumours and experiences within the company. The powers that be instructed their engineers to identify and track down every component in their fleet that originated from Flight 401 and then remove them. The story of the ghosts of Flight 401 remains one of the most famous ghost stories in modern times. It is well documented, with a large number of people involved, an official investigation and written reports regarding these encounters. While some have argued that witnesses may have willed these apparitions into existence or manufactured false memories due to anticipation, many of those involved were skilled and experienced professionals with no history of making such spurious claims. The events on Flight 401 and the subsequent encounters with the deceased crew members by employees and passengers, well, they're difficult to dismiss outright. It is possible that some employees may have exaggerated or created stories to push the company to remove the salvaged parts from the aircraft. However, the experiences of passengers who had no prior knowledge of the events and reported their encounters independently of airline employees suggest something more sinister could have been at play. Regardless of the evidence or lack thereof in physical terms, it seems that once the last remnants of Flight 401 were removed and laid to rest, the spirits of her crew finally found peace. Their desire to ensure that no other person shared their tragic fate had been fulfilled, allowing them to move on. That's it for this video, folks. I can't thank you enough for taking the time to watch my content. Please stay safe out there, tell someone that you love them, and above all else, keep smiling.